Commander Zethkar stood on the bridge of his warship and felt nothing but confidence. His tall, gray body moved with the smooth grace that all Velthari possessed. The small lights under his skin pulsed blue and green as his mind processed battle. Data through the neural implant in his skull. Around him, his crew worked in perfect silence, their movements precise and calculated. The Velthari were the greatest warriors in the galaxy. Everyone knew this. In 300 years, they had never lost a single battle. Their technology was superior to every other species. Their tactics were flawless. Their soldiers never panicked, never made mistakes, never showed mercy when mercy was weakness. Zethkar had studied war since he was young. He knew every battle strategy ever created. He could predict enemy movements before they happened. His neural implant could process 1,000,000 different combat scenarios in seconds and choose the perfect response every time. This was why the High Command had chosen him to deal with the humans. The humans were a new species that had recently begun expanding from their home world called Earth. Intelligence reports showed they were primitive. They used crude weapons that fired metal projectiles instead of energy beams. Their ships moved slowly using chemical rockets instead of quantum drives. They had no neural implants, no genetic enhancements, no advanced battle computers. Most amusing of all, they seemed to fight with emotion instead of logic. Velthari analysts had studied human conflict recordings and found them chaotic and inefficient. Humans wasted resources on wounded soldiers instead of leaving them behind. They made tactical decisions based on feelings instead of data. They even had rules about what was acceptable in war, as if war could be civilized. The target was a human colony called New Terra. It was perfect for first contact. The colony had 50,000 civilians and only a small security force. No major military installations, no heavy weapons, no orbital defenses. Intelligence estimated the humans could mount resistance for perhaps 6 hours before surrendering. Zethkar's fleet consisted of 12 warships, each one capable of destroying an entire city. His ground forces numbered 3,000 soldiers equipped with plasma weapons and powered armor. Against primitive humans with their chemical explosives and metal bullets, it would be like hunting insects with laser cannons. As his ship moved through space toward the human colony, Zethkar reviewed the battle plan one more time. It was elegant in its simplicity. First, a demonstration of power to shock the humans into submission. A few plasma strikes on military targets would show them the futility of resistance. Then an ultimatum delivered in their primitive language. Finally, occupation and integration into the Velthari Empire. The humans would probably surrender immediately. Most species did when they saw Velthari technology. Those that didn't surrender usually broke after the first demonstration of plasma fire. Either way, Zethkar expected defiling his victory report within one standard day. His tactical officer, Sub-Commander Yethlin, approached with the latest intelligence update. The human colony had detected their approach, but showed no signs of panic. No evacuation attempts, no desperate calls for help, no frantic military preparations. The humans were simply going about their daily business as if a Velthari war fleet wasn't bearing down on them. Zethkar found this mildly interesting. Most species either fled in terror or tried to negotiate as soon as they detected Velthari ships. Perhaps humans were simply too primitive to understand the danger they faced. Or perhaps they were frozen with fear. Either explanation fit with what Velthari science knew about inferior species. The planet grew larger on the main display. New Terra was a pleasant world with blue oceans and green continents. Primitive but habitable. The humans had built their colony in a river valley, surrounded by low hills. Zethkar's tactical computers immediately identified 17 different approach vectors that would give his forces overwhelming advantage. The colony itself looked exactly like the intelligence reports had described. Simple buildings made of local materials, roads that followed the natural landscape instead of efficient straight lines, and lots of open spaces that served no tactical purpose. It was the kind of settlement built by a species that had never faced a real military threat. Zeth-Kar opened a communication channel to his fleet commanders. Each ship captain appeared on his screen, their gray faces calm and professional. These were the best officers in the Velthari military, veterans of dozens of successful conquests. Final briefing, Zeth-Kar announced. Target analysis confirms. Minimal resistance capability. Human weapons are projectile-based with limited range and penetration. Their vehicles are slow and lightly armored. No energy shields, no plasma weapons, no orbital platforms. Estimated time to complete subjugation is 6 hours maximum. Captain Velther of the 2nd Assault Ship nodded. What about civilian populations? Commander? Standard protocol for resistance? Minimal force unless they interfere with military objectives, Zeth-Kar replied. These humans appear to lack proper military organization. Removing their leadership should collapse any resistance immediately. It was true. Velthari analysts had noticed that human societies depended heavily on individual leaders instead of efficient command structures. Cut off the head, and the body would die. Simple and predictable. As his fleet entered the planet's atmosphere, Zeth-Kar felt the familiar calm that came before victory. His neural implant was already calculating optimal bombardment patterns. His soldiers were checking their equipment one final time. His ships were moving into perfect attack formation. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The first target was the human security outpost on the edge of the colony. It was a small building that housed perhaps 50 soldiers and their primitive weapons. Zeth-Kar's tactical computers had identified it as the primary military threat, though calling it a threat was almost insulting to the word. Target acquired, his weapons officer reported. Plasma cannons charged and ready. Zeth-Kar studied the building through his ship's sensors. He could see human figures moving around inside, probably going through their daily routines without any idea what was about to happen. Part of him almost felt sorry for them. They were about to face technology so advanced it might as well be magic. Fire, he commanded. 3 plasma beams lanced down from his flagship. Each beam carried enough energy to vaporize a city block. The security outpost simply disappeared in a flash of superheated air and molten metal. Where the building had stood, only a smoking crater remained. Zeth-Kar waited for the human response. This was usually when primitive species began broadcasting surrender messages or pleas for mercy. His communication officers were monitoring all human frequencies, ready to receive the inevitable capitulation. Instead, something unexpected happened. Humans began moving toward the crater, not away from it, as any rational species would do after witnessing such devastating firepower. Toward it. Zeth-Kar watched through his sensors as humans emerged from buildings all across the colony and started running toward the destroyed outpost. They moved with purpose, not panic. Commander, his sensor officer reported, I'm detecting organized movement throughout the human settlement. They appear to be mobilizing. Zeth-Kar studied the readings. The humans were indeed organizing, but not in any way his tactical computers could recognize. Instead of establishing defensive perimeters or evacuating civilians, they seemed to be gathering weapons and equipment from various locations. Their movements followed no logical military pattern that Velthari doctrine could identify. Perhaps they're preparing to surrender, Sub-Commander Yethlin suggested, gathering their weapons to hand them over. Zeth-Kar considered this possibility. It would fit with primitive psychology. Show them overwhelming force and allow them to surrender with dignity. It was the sensible response to an impossible situation. But something about the way the humans moved troubled him. There was no fear in their actions, no hesitation. They moved like soldiers preparing for battle, not like defeated enemies preparing to surrender. "Open a communication channel," Zethkar ordered. "Let's give them a chance to be reasonable." The human communication network was crude but functional. Within moments, Zethkar was broadcasting to every receiver in the colony. He spoke in their primitive language, which his translation systems handled easily. "People of New Terra," his voice echoed across the settlement, "you have witnessed the power of the Velthari Empire. Your military installation has been destroyed. In seconds, you have no means to resist our superior technology. Surrender now, and you will be treated with the respect due to a conquered but dignified opponent. Resist and face annihilation." The response came immediately. A human voice, calm and steady, replied over the same channel. "This is Mayor Bill Jackson of New Terra Colony. We've received your message. We're not surrendering." Zethkar felt his neural implant process this information and immediately flag it as an error. The tactical analysis was clear. The humans had no chance of victory. Zero probability of successful resistance. Their response made no logical sense. "Perhaps they don't understand," Yethlin suggested. "Their primitive minds might not be able to comprehend what they've seen." Zethkar nodded. It was the only reasonable explanation. He opened the channel again. "Mayor Jackson, you may not fully understand." Zethkar watched his ground forces land with perfect precision. 3,000 Velthari soldiers descended from the sky in armored drop pods, each one hitting its designated coordinates exactly. Their powered armor gleamed silver in the afternoon. Sun as they formed into tactical squads and began advancing on the human colony. The landing should have ended any thoughts of human resistance. The drop pods alone weighed several tons each and left deep craters in the earth. The soldiers inside were 8 feet tall and protected by armor that could deflect small explosions. Their plasma rifles could cut through metal like it was paper, but the humans didn't run. Through his sensors, Zethkar could see small groups of colonists moving through the settlement. They carried primitive weapons and moved with purpose. Some had hunting rifles that fired solid bullets. Others held tools that could serve as weapons. A few had what appeared to be homemade explosives. Against Velthari technology, these weapons were useless. But the humans didn't seem to understand this basic fact. The first contact between the species happened near the colony's main road. Squad Leader Kethvar was advancing with 12 soldiers when a human stepped out from behind a damaged vehicle. The human was obviously a soldier, based on his clothing and bearing, though his equipment looked ancient by Velthari standards. Zethkar focused his sensors on the encounter. The human was male, perhaps 30 years old, with brown hair and determined eyes. His uniform bore the name Murphy. He held a primitive projectile weapon and stood directly in the path of 12 advancing Velthari warriors. Any rational being would have surrendered immediately. The tactical situation was hopeless. One human with a crude weapon against 12 soldiers in powered armor. The outcome was so obvious that Zethkar's computers didn't even bother calculating odds. Instead, Sergeant Jake Murphy smiled. It wasn't the smile of madness or desperation. It was something else entirely. Murphy looked at the approaching aliens, like he was genuinely happy to see them. Like this was exactly where he wanted to be. Then Murphy opened fire. His weapon made sharp cracking sounds as it fired metal projectiles. The bullets struck Velthari armor and bounced off harmlessly, exactly as expected. Murphy's magazine held perhaps 30 rounds and would be empty in seconds. After that, he would be defenseless. But Murphy didn't try to find cover. He didn't attempt to retreat to a better position. He walked forward while firing, moving directly toward the squad of aliens who could kill him with a single shot. When his weapon clicked empty, Murphy threw it aside and drew a long metal blade from his belt. The knife was obviously handmade and wouldn't penetrate Velthari armor any better than his bullets had. It was a completely useless gesture. Murphy charged. Zethkar's neural implants struggled to process what he was seeing. The human's tactical choice made no sense. Murphy wasn't trying to win the fight, because winning was impossible. He wasn't trying to escape, because he was moving toward his enemies instead of away from them. He wasn't even trying to delay them, because his attack was actually speeding up the encounter. What was Murphy trying to accomplish? The Velthari soldiers reacted with professional efficiency. Squad leader Kethver raised his plasma rifle and prepared to end the engagement with a single shot. It would be clean and quick. The human would be vaporized instantly, and the squad could continue its advance. But something went wrong. Murphy's charge wasn't random. As he ran forward, he suddenly dove to the left just as Kethvar fired. The plasma beam missed by inches and struck a fuel tank behind Murphy, creating a massive explosion. The blast knocked 2 Velthari soldiers off their feet and temporarily blinded the others. In that moment of confusion, Murphy reached the squad. What happened next violated every principle of combat that Zethkar understood. Murphy couldn't hurt the Velthari through their armor, or he could confuse them. He grabbed Kethver's weapon and pulled it sideways just as another soldier fired, causing that shot to hit a third alien instead of Murphy. Murphy's knife couldn't penetrate armor, but it could jam into joints and weapon mechanisms. He drove the blade into the gaps between armor plates, not to kill but to disable. When 2 soldiers tried to grab him, he used their own strength against them, causing them to crash into each other. It was chaos. Pure, beautiful chaos. Zethkar watched in fascination as one human with primitive weapons somehow managed to disable 3 Velthari soldiers and wound 2 others before finally being brought down. It should have been impossible. Every tactical computer in the fleet agreed that it was impossible, but Murphy had done it anyway. More disturbing was what Zethkar saw in the human's face during those final moments. As Murphy fell with multiple plasma burns across his body, he was still smiling. Not the grimace of pain or the desperation of defeat. He looked satisfied, like he had accomplished exactly what he set out to do. As Murphy died, he spoke one word in his own language. Zethkar's translator rendered it as remember. The pattern repeated throughout the colony. Human after human faced impossible odds with the same inexplicable joy. A woman named Lisa Carter was treating wounded civilians when Velthari soldiers surrounded her makeshift medical station. Instead of surrendering or fleeing, she picked up a fallen soldier's weapon and fought while continuing to bandage injuries. An elderly man called Ben Harris was cornered in his workshop by an entire squad. He had no weapons except the tools of his trade. But Harris had been busy during the short time between the landing and his discovery. He had rigged his entire shop with explosives made from farming chemicals and old vehicle parts. When the Velthari soldiers entered his workshop, Harris detonated everything at once. The explosion destroyed the building and killed Harris instantly, but it also took out 6 alien soldiers and disabled their transport vehicle. What bothered Zethkar wasn't the tactical result. Losing a few soldiers was acceptable in any military operation. What bothered him was the look on Harris's face in the security footage from just before the explosion. The old man had been laughing. These humans were fighting like they were already dead. Like survival wasn't even part of their calculations. They traded their lives for small tactical advantages that wouldn't change the final outcome. They seemed to understand that defeat was certain, but they fought anyway with genuine enthusiasm. A group of human civilians had barricaded themselves in the colony's school building. When Velthari forces surrounded them, the humans didn't negotiate or try to escape. Instead, They sent out the children through a back exit while the adults prepared to fight. The human teacher, a young woman named Amy Foster, organized the defense. She had no military training and was armed with nothing more than a hunting rifle and some kitchen knives. Against powered armor and plasma weapons, she might as well have been throwing rocks, but Foster didn't seem to care about the odds. She positioned her people with careful thought, turning the school into a maze of obstacles and traps. When the Velthari soldiers entered the building, they found themselves fighting room by room against defenders who knew every inch of the terrain. Foster herself was the last to fall. She had retreated to the main classroom where she made her final stand. When Zethkar's soldiers finally cornered her, she was sitting calmly at the teacher's desk, still holding her empty rifle. "Is that all you've got?" she asked, looking directly at the squad leader. Those were her last words. Throughout the colony, similar scenes played out dozens of times. Humans who couldn't win chose to fight anyway. They turned every building into a fortress, every tool into a weapon, every death into a lesson for their enemies. But the most disturbing encounter happened when Velthari forces reached the colony's communication center. A small group of humans had fortified the building and were broadcasting messages to other human settlements. When Zethkar's soldiers surrounded them, the humans didn't try to escape or destroy their equipment. Instead, they opened the doors and invited the aliens inside. The leader was a middle-aged man named Dan Phillips, who worked as the colony's chief engineer. Phillips offered to surrender the communication equipment peacefully if the Velthari would guarantee safe passage for the remaining civilians. It seemed like the first rational response Zethkar had encountered from any human. Phillips was thinking logically, trying to minimize casualties through negotiation. This was how civilized species were supposed to behave. Squad leader Vex then accepted the surrender and entered the communication center with his team. Phillips showed them around the facility, explaining how the primitive human technology worked. He was cooperative, helpful, and completely non-threatening. Right up until he triggered the demolition charges. Phillips had wired the entire building with explosives while pretending to negotiate. The blast vaporized him instantly, along with 8 Velthari soldiers and the colony's entire communication network. But before he died, Phillips had transmitted one final message to other human worlds. The message was simple: they can be beaten. Zethkar stared at the smoking ruins of the communication center and felt something he had never experienced before. His neural implant was providing him with tactical data, casualty reports, and progress updates. By every measure, the Velthari were winning decisively. So why did he feel like he was losing? 3 days had passed since the battle began, and Zethkar's perfect conquest had become something he couldn't understand. His forces controlled most of the colony's surface, but the humans refused to accept defeat. Worse, they were becoming more dangerous as time went on, not less. The surviving humans had retreated into the underground tunnel system that connected the colony's buildings. These tunnels were meant for utilities and emergency shelter, but the humans had turned them into a weapon. They moved through the darkness like ghosts, appearing where they weren't expected and vanishing before Velthari forces could respond. Leading this underground resistance was a human named Captain Ryan Brooks. Intelligence reports said Brooks had been the colony's security chief before the invasion. Now he commanded perhaps 200 survivors in a campaign that made no tactical sense, but somehow kept working. Zethkar studied the tunnel maps his engineers had recovered. The human underground network was chaotic and inefficient. Passages curved around natural obstacles instead of following straight lines. Junction points were irregular and poorly marked. By Velthari standards, it was a terrible design for military operations, but Brooks was using these flaws as advantages. The confusing layout that frustrated Velthari soldiers was familiar territory to the humans who had built it. They knew which passages connected and which ones were dead ends. They could move quickly through areas where aliens had to proceed slowly. More importantly, Rooks seemed to be thinking several steps ahead of every move Zethkar made. When Velthari forces secured important surface installations, Brooks attacked. Their supply lines underground. When Zethkar reinforced the supply routes, Brooks hit the installations. When guards were posted at tunnel entrances, Brooks found exits that weren't on any map. It was like fighting an enemy who could read his mind. The breakthrough came when Zethkar's forces finally cornered a large group of humans in the colonies. Old Mine Shaft. The mine was a dead end with only one entrance. Brooks and at least 50 other humans were trapped inside with no way to escape. Zethkar had them surrounded with superior numbers and firepower. It should have been the end of human resistance. Sub-Commander Yethlin led the assault team into the mine tunnels. The passages were narrow and dark, perfect for Velthari soldiers. With their advanced sensors and night vision equipment, the humans would be fighting blind while the aliens could see perfectly. The first sign something was wrong came when Yethlin's team found the mine completely empty, not abandoned, empty. There were signs that humans had been there recently. Food containers, medical supplies, weapons caches, but no people. 50 humans had somehow vanished from a dead-end tunnel system with only one exit. Zethkar checked his perimeter sensors. No humans had left the mine through the main entrance. His aerial scouts reported no movement on the surface above the mine. The underground passages his engineers had mapped showed no connections to other tunnel systems. The humans had simply disappeared. The answer came 6 hours later when Brooks and his people attacked 3 different Velthari positions simultaneously. They emerged from storm drains, maintenance shafts, and air vents that connected to the mine through passages so small that Velthari sensors had dismissed them as insignificant. The humans had crawled through spaces barely wide enough for their bodies, moving in complete darkness through tunnels that would have terrified most species. They had done it silently and quickly, coordinating their movements without any electronic communication that Velthari equipment could detect. Each attack was precisely timed to cause maximum confusion. While Velthari forces responded to the first assault, the second attack hit their command post. When reinforcements moved to protect the command post, the third attack destroyed their main ammunition depot. Brooks had turned his trapped position into a launching point for a complex operation that scattered Velthari forces across the entire colony. By the time Zethkar understood what had happened, the humans had vanished back into their tunnels with captured weapons and supplies. But the tactical victory wasn't what disturbed Zethkar most. It was the way the humans had coordinated their attacks without any visible communication. They had moved like parts of a single organism, each group knowing exactly what the others were doing without sending signals or sharing information. How are they doing this? The question became more urgent when Zethkar received reports from his perimeter guards. A group of human children had been spotted near the colony's school building, apparently trying to rescue their teacher, who was being held prisoner. The children were led by a teenage girl named Emma Price, who couldn't have been more than 16 years old. Standard Velthari protocol was clear. Capture the children and use them as leverage to force adult surrender. The tactic worked on every civilized species, because parents would sacrifice anything to protect their young. Zethkar ordered squad leader Kethfer to secure the children and broadcast surrender demands to the remaining human fighters. It was a logical strategy that should have ended the resistance immediately, but when Kethfer reached the school, he found it was a trap. The children were trying to rescue their teacher. They were bait. As soon as Velthari soldiers entered the building, every human in the colony converged on the school from all directions. They came through tunnels, over rooftops, and across open ground with complete disregard for their own safety. The assault was tactically insane. Humans with primitive weapons charged directly at superior alien forces in broad daylight. They had no cover, no support, and no chance of survival. By every rule of warfare, they should have been slaughtered before they got within 100 meters of the building. Instead, the attack succeeded because it was so irrational that Velthari tactical computers couldn't predict it. Zethkar's soldiers were positioned to defend against logical assault patterns, not against enemies who ignored basic military principles. When humans charged plasma cannons with hunting rifles, when a postal worker named Carl Davis rammed his delivery truck into a Velthari tank, when the colony's doctor led hospital patients in a frontal assault, the aliens didn't know how to respond. But what horrified Zethkar most was realizing that the humans had coordinated this impossible attack without any communication he could detect. They hadn't planned it in advance because there hadn't been time. They had simply known, all at the same moment, that their children were in danger and had moved to protect them. It was like they shared a single mind. Dr. Susan Williams had been treating wounded humans in her improvised field hospital when the attack began. She was a small woman with gray hair who looked like she had never held a weapon in her life. But when the assault started, Williams organized her patients into a fighting unit and led them against Velthari positions. Some of her patients could barely walk. Others were missing limbs or suffering from severe burns. None of them were fit for combat by any reasonable standard. But they fought anyway, using crutches as clubs and medical equipment as weapons. Williams herself charged a Velthari command post armed with nothing but a surgical laser. The device was designed for delicate medical work, not combat, but she somehow managed to disable 2 soldiers before being killed. Her last action was to destroy a tactical computer that contained important battle plans. A maintenance worker named Eddie Walsh had been hiding in the colony's power plant when he heard the sounds of battle. Walsh was old and overweight, clearly not a soldier, but he left his hiding place and sabotaged the main generator, plunging half the colony into darkness, just as Velthari forces were trying to coordinate their response to the human attack. Power failure lasted only minutes before backup systems restored electricity, but those minutes were enough. In the darkness, humans moved with confidence, while aliens stumbled through unfamiliar terrain. Several key Velthari positions were overrun before the lights came back on. Most disturbing of all was watching the human children during the battle. Instead of crying or hiding, they helped the adults fight. 10-year-old kids carried ammunition and messages. Teenagers operated captured alien equipment. Even the smallest children contributed by creating distractions or pointing out enemy positions. They fought like they had been born for war. The battle ended when Captain Brooks led a final assault on Zethkar's landing zone. The humans had somehow acquired several Velthari plasma weapons and turned them on their former owners. Brooks himself carried a captured rifle that should have been too heavy for a human to lift, but he wielded it with deadly accuracy. As Velthari forces retreated to their ships, Zethkar watched the humans celebrating their victory. They had lost more than half their number in the 3-day battle. Their colony was in ruins. Their weapons were exhausted and their supplies nearly gone. But they had won. Against impossible odds, using inferior equipment with no hope of reinforcement, they had defeated a superior alien force through pure determination and tactical creativity. Standing in the smoking ruins of the school building, Captain Brooks looked up at Zethkar's retreating ships and smiled. It was the same smile that Sergeant Murphy had worn, the same expression that Dr. Williams and Eddie Walsh and all the others had shown in their final moments. Zethkar thought the nightmare would end when his forces retreated to orbit. He was wrong. The humans weren't finished with him yet. From the bridge of his flagship, Zethkar watched the surviving colonists emerge from their underground tunnels. There were perhaps 300 humans left alive out of the original 50,000. Their colony was destroyed, their military equipment exhausted, and their leaders dead or wounded. By any reasonable measure, they were defeated. But the humans didn't act defeated. Instead of mourning their losses or trying to rebuild, they were scavenging through the wreckage of the battle. They collected pieces of destroyed Velthari equipment, salvaged weapons from dead soldiers, and gathered materials that should have been useless to a primitive species. Zethkar's science officer, Commander Velsara, approached with a worried expression. "Sir, we're detecting unusual energy readings from the planet's surface. The humans appear to be working with our technology. This was impossible." Velthari equipment was designed to be operated only by species with neural implants, an advanced understanding of quantum mechanics. Human brains were too primitive to comprehend even basic Velthari science, much less reverse engineer complex military hardware. But the energy readings were real dot through his ship's sensors. Zethkar watched a human engineer named Tony Mitchell, leading a group of survivors in what looked like a construction project. They had dragged the wreckage of a destroyed Velthari transport to the colony's maintenance bay and were taking it apart piece by piece. Mitchell had no formal training in alien technology. His background was in simple human engineering, working with crude chemical systems and primitive electronics. He should have been as capable of understanding Velthari plasma drives as a child was of comprehending stellar physics. Yet somehow, Mitchell was making progress. The human team worked without proper tools or technical manuals. They figured out component functions through trial and error, testing connections until they found combinations that produced useful results. It was an incredibly inefficient approach that wasted enormous amounts of time and materials, but it was working. Within hours, Mitchell's team had identified the transport's power source and begun adapting it to human systems. They couldn't replicate Velthari technology, but they could modify it for their own purposes. Like primitive people learning to use tools they didn't fully understand, they focused on function rather than theory. The first sign of real danger came when Zethkar's sensors detected a new energy signature rising from the planet, a human civilian transport ship, the kind used for routine cargo runs between colonies, was lifting off from the settlement. But the ship's power readings were all wrong. "Sir," Velsara reported, "that civilian vessel is showing Velthari plasma signatures. Somehow, they've installed our weapon systems on their ship." Zethkar studied the approaching vessel through his tactical displays. It was a converted cargo hauler with obvious modifications welded to its hull. The ship looked like it had been assembled by children using random parts. By all rights, it should have fallen apart as soon as it left atmosphere dot instead. It was accelerating toward his fleet with obvious hostile intent. The ship was piloted by a woman named Helen Parks, who had been the colony's postal service coordinator before the invasion. Parks had no military training and no experience with space combat. Her vessel was a civilian transport armed with scavenged alien weapons that she barely understood how to operate, against 12 Velthari warships with trained crews and superior technology. Parks should have been vaporized within seconds. But she wasn't alone. More ships were rising from the planet's surface. A construction mech that had been converted into an improvised fighter. A luxury yacht armed with welded-on plasma cannons. Even the colony's garbage collection vessel, now bristling with weapons that shouldn't have been able to function. Each ship was piloted by humans who had no business being in space combat. A construction foreman named Pete Johnson flew the garbage scow with the enthusiasm of a veteran pilot. A retired schoolteacher called Martha Stone commanded the luxury yacht like it was a military destroyer. None of them should have been able to operate Velthari technology. None of them should have been able to modify alien systems for human use. None of them should have been willing to attack a superior military force with improvised weapons and civilian spacecraft. They did it anyway. The battle that followed was unlike anything in Zethkar's experience. The human ships moved with reckless aggression, diving through Velthari formations without regard for their own safety. They used ramming attacks, point-blank weapons fire, and tactical maneuvers that no sane pilot would attempt. Helen Parks brought her converted transport in so close to Zethkar's flagship that their hulls nearly touched. At that range, her improvised weapons could penetrate Velthari shields through pure brute force. But at that range, a single return shot would destroy her completely. Parks fired first, her plasma cannon, cobbled together from salvaged components, and held in place with metal cables, punched through the flagship's armor and disabled 3 critical systems. The shot should have been impossible with their crude targeting computers, but Parks somehow knew exactly where to aim. When Zethkar's gunners returned fire, Parks was already gone. Her ship twisted away from the incoming plasma beams with precision that suggested years of combat experience instead of hours of desperate improvisation. Pete, Johnson's garbage scow, attacked like a berserker, ramming Velthari fighters and using its industrial equipment as weapons. The ship's waste compactor became a missile launcher. Its cargo manipulator arms grabbed enemy fighters and crushed them against the scow's armored hull. Johnson himself was laughing over the communication channels as he fought. Zethkar could hear the human's voice echoing through space as he deliberately crashed his ship into a Velthari destroyer, taking both vessels down in a brilliant explosion. Martha Stone proved that age was no barrier to effective combat. Her yacht danced between Velthari warships like a fish swimming through nets, always exactly where the aliens weren't expecting. She used the ship's small size and civilian systems to confuse enemy targeting computers, appearing as harmless cargo one moment and deadly fighter the next. But the most disturbing aspect of the space battle wasn't the tactical impossibility of human success. It was what Zethkar finally understood about human nature. The humans weren't trying to win the battle. They were trying to make sure that winning would cost the Velthari everything. Every human pilot who died made certain their death would be remembered. They broadcast messages over open channels, telling their enemies exactly what they thought of alien invaders. They shared personal stories, talked about their families, and made sure that every Velthari soldier would remember them as individuals rather than anonymous casualties. Helen Parks spoke directly to Zethkar as her damaged ship limped toward his flagship for one final attack. "I'm a postal worker," she said calmly over the communication channel. "I deliver mail and sort packages. I've never hurt anyone in my life, but you came to my home and killed my neighbors. So now I'm going to kill you." Her ship exploded against Zethkar's shields in a flash of brilliant light, but her words echoed in his mind long after the debris had scattered. These humans understood something that no other species had ever grasped. They knew that some victories were worse than defeats. They made sure that every Velthari who survived the battle would carry the memory of human faces, human voices, human determination. They turned their deaths into weapons that would haunt their enemies forever. As the last human ship fell silent, Zethkar realized that his fleet had won the battle, but lost something far more important. His soldiers were reporting strange symptoms, nightmares about dead humans, phantom voices speaking in human languages, visual hallucinations of human faces appearing in reflective surfaces. The humans had done something that no enemy had ever managed before. They had gotten inside Velthari minds and refused to leave. Sub-Commander Yeflin approached with the casualty reports. The numbers showed a clear Velthari victory. Superior technology had prevailed over human desperation. They Colony was pacified and ready for occupation. But Yethlin's hands were shaking as he delivered the report. His neural implant was flickering with irregular patterns, and his eyes held a haunted look that Zethkar had never seen in a Velthari officer. "Commander," Yethlin said quietly, "the men are requesting psychological evaluation. They are reporting unusual experiences, dreams, memories that aren't their own. Some are asking to be transferred away from human space." Zethkar understood. He was experiencing the same thing. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jake Murphy's smile. He heard Amy Foster asking if that was all they had. He watched Helen Parks piloting her improvised warship into certain death with absolute determination. The humans had lost the battle completely. But they had won something more important than tactical victory. They had taught their enemies what it meant to face an opponent who fought with love instead of hatred, determination instead of desperation, and joy instead of fear. And once you learned that lesson, you could never forget it. Zethkar looked down at the ruined colony and realized that the humans had achieved the impossible. 3 cycles had passed since the battle at New Terra, but for Zethkar, the war had never ended. He stood in his private quarters aboard the flagship, staring at his reflection in the polished metal wall. The face looking back at him was still, recognizably Velthari, but something fundamental had changed. His eyes held shadows that hadn't been there before the humans. Sleep had become impossible. Every time Zethkar closed his eyes, he saw Jake Murphy's smile. The dead human's face appeared with perfect clarity, as if Murphy was standing right beside him. Sometimes Zethkar could hear Murphy's voice saying that single word he had spoken before dying. "Remember," Zethkar remembered. He remembered everything. The neural implant that had once provided crystal-clear tactical analysis now showed him human faces during every combat simulation. When he tried to plan military operations, Amy Foster's voice echoed in his mind, asking if that was all he had. When he reviewed weapons specifications, he heard Helen Parks explaining that she was just a postal worker who had never hurt anyone. Before, the Velthari High Command had classified the New Terra incident as a successful pacification with acceptable losses. The official reports described the human resistance as primitive and disorganized. The colony had been secured and prepared for occupation according to standard protocol. But the soldiers who had been there knew the truth. Commander Velsara had requested transfer to a different sector within days of returning from New Terra. She claimed her neural implant was malfunctioning, showing her false data and phantom images. The medical technicians found nothing wrong with her equipment, but they approved the transfer anyway. Velsara wasn't the only one making such requests. Sub-Commander Yethlin had stopped eating. He sat in his quarters for hours, staring at nothing, and muttering words in human languages that he shouldn't have been able to speak. When questioned, he claimed he was trying to understand what the humans had been thinking during the battle. Squad Leader Kethver had been found standing in the ship's observation deck at all hours, looking toward the sector where New Terra was located. He told anyone who asked that he was watching for human ships, though intelligence confirmed that no human vessels were operating in the area. The pattern was spreading throughout the fleet. Soldiers reported dreams about dead humans. Officers complained of hearing human voices during quiet moments. Even crew members who had never set foot on New Terra were experiencing what the medical staff called phantom memory syndrome. Zethkar knew what was really happening. The humans had infected his people with something worse than any biological weapon. They had planted the seeds of doubt in Velthari minds, made them question everything they believed about warfare and victory. The infection was spreading beyond his own fleet. Reports came in from other Velthari commanders who had encountered human forces elsewhere in the galaxy. The symptoms were always the same. Soldiers who had fought humans became haunted, distracted, less effective in combat. They started questioning orders and hesitating during battles. Most disturbing were the reports from the medical corps. Velthari, who had fought humans, were experiencing what the doctors called empathy overflow. They were beginning to feel emotional connections to their enemies, something that should have been impossible for a species bred for military efficiency. Captain Nexver of the 3rd Assault Fleet had sent a classified report about an encounter with human forces near the Centauri system. His description matched Zethkar's experience perfectly. Humans who fought with impossible determination, who seemed to welcome death as long as they could inflict psychological damage on their enemies. Don't fight to win, Nexver had written. They fight to be remembered. Every human who dies becomes a ghost that haunts our soldiers forever. I'm beginning to think that losing to them might be preferable to winning. The report had been buried by High Command, but copies were circulating through unofficial channels. Other commanders were reading Nexver's words and recognizing their own experiences. A network of traumatized officers was forming, united by their shared encounters with human warfare. Zethkar had tried to warn his superiors about the true nature of the human threat. He had submitted detailed analyses of human psychological warfare tactics, documented the long-term effects on Velthari personnel, and recommended immediate changes to military doctrine. His reports had been dismissed as post-combat stress reactions and filed away in classified archives. The High Command didn't want to hear that their perfect military machine had been broken by a species that used emotion as a weapon. They refused to acknowledge that humans could defeat Velthari forces through pure force of will rather than superior technology. But the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Recruitment rates were dropping as word spread about human encounters. Veteran soldiers were requesting early retirement or transfer to sectors far from human space. Some were even deserting, abandoning their posts rather than risk facing humans in battle again. Zethkar understood why. He had considered desertion himself. The breaking point came when he received new orders from High Command. Another human colony had been identified for pacification. The target was a mining settlement called Hope's End, with approximately 30,000 inhabitants. Intelligence reported minimal military presence and no significant defenses. It was exactly the kind of target that should have been perfect for a quick, clean conquest. But Zethkar knew better now. He understood what those 30,000 humans would do when faced with Velthari invasion. They would fight with smiles on their faces. They would turn every death into a weapon. They would make sure that every Velthari soldier remembered their names and faces forever. And when the battle was over, Zethkar's forces would technically win while losing everything that made them who they were. He couldn't do it again. He couldn't watch more of his people become infected with human memories, human emotions, human determination. He couldn't be responsible for turning more efficient Velthari soldiers into haunted shadows of their former selves. That night, Zethkar sat in his command chamber and began composing a message to the High Command. His hands shook as he wrote, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. To the Supreme Military Council, he began, I am submitting an urgent recommendation for immediate peace negotiations with human governments. This recommendation is based on extensive tactical analysis and direct combat experience with human forces. He paused, knowing that his next words would effectively end his military career. The humans cannot be defeated through conventional warfare, not because they possess superior technology or tactical skills, but because they fight with psychological weapons that our forces are not equipped to counter. Every victory against humans comes at a cost that may ultimately destroy us as a species. Zethkar wrote for hours, documenting everything he had learned about human warfare. He described how humans turned defeat into victory, how they used their own deaths as weapons, how they infected their enemies with doubt and memory and something that might have been conscience. The humans have taught us that there are fates worse than military defeat, he concluded. They have shown us that some victories are so costly that they become indistinguishable from surrender. I recommend that we negotiate a peace treaty before we lose something more valuable than territory or resources, before we lose ourselves. He sealed the message and transmitted it to High Command, knowing it would probably be dismissed like all his previous warnings. But he had to try. Someone had to speak for the soldiers who were being destroyed by human memories, who were learning to feel things that Velthari weren't supposed to feel. As he finished writing, Sethkar heard Jake Murphy's voice one more time, clear as if the dead human was standing beside him. Remember. Sethkar smiled for the first time since New Terra. It wasn't the cold smile of Velthari superiority. It was something warmer, more human. I remember, he whispered to the empty room. Outside his window, the stars looked different than they had before the humans. They looked like places where people lived and died and fought for things they believed in. They looked like homes worth defending instead of territories to be conquered. Sethkar understood now why his soldiers were breaking down, why they couldn't sleep, why they heard human voices in the darkness. The humans hadn't just defeated them in battle. They had taught them what it meant to be alive. And once you learned that lesson, you could never go back to being just a machine. The war was over, even if High Command didn't know it yet. The humans had won not by destroying their enemies, but by making them human. Some victories, Sethkar realized, were too beautiful to resist.